Hang on. Cats can never make up their minds. I mean, in a cat's perfect world, it's like, oh, she wants to sit on my lap. That is the assumption that I won't be moving at all, including breathing, so that she can get nice and comfortable. But that's not going to happen. So there's that. But anyway, we just finish putting up social media stuff, and then we'll get started. So I'm a little bit late today. Just gonna finish. Okay. Ow. See, now the cat's all mad because I'm moving. Alright, let's get that out of the way. And just fix the lighting and then we'll get started. No. Too bright. Too much. I have too much blue, I think. It's too much blue. There you go. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Luke. And yes, it's been a while since I've done a reading stream. It's been 2 weeks. Last week I missed it. If you don't remember, basically what happened was I had to have my internet fixed. It's been looking good. Basically what they did was they just replaced the router entirely, and so because when I had the tech guy come in, he said, "Oh, the cord looks fine." My the coaxial cord, or coax cord for short. The guy said it was okay, so he just replaced the router, and things have been working pretty well. I haven't had any disconnection problems as of late, so that's good, and I hope it stays that way. Anyway, so that was what was up last week, and of course I did a Saturday Triangle Strategies makeup stream, quote unquote, just because I've been loving to play that game. I'll try and get 3 more Triangle Strategy streams next week as well. We'll do like Monday, Wednesday, and we'll pick up another day in the week. But don't worry, the Friday Bible reading is back. We are back at it. I just realized, like, wow, it's so weird to think how fast time goes. Like, it's already like March, like late. We're like past mid-March, so we're approaching the later part of March. I've already been doing this for like 10 weeks. I mean, thinking about like all those seasonal animes that started in January are about to end pretty soon, so that's kind of weird. But anyway, yeah, so I'll be back at doing this for a while. We might take a short break after we finish the Book of Luke, which should only take us a couple more weeks. This Book of Luke is not that long. But anyway, well, the reason why it's not that long is because we do 2 chapters every week. If we only did 1 chapter every week, then it would take a really long time, because then it would take you half the year to do the Book of Luke. And we do want to cover Acts, which will take quite a bit of time, and Romans as well. But anyway, with that said, today we are starting with Luke chapter 18. We're going to read 18 and 19 today. That's the plan. If you have a Bible, I encourage you to follow along. I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV for short. With that, I'll give you a moment to flip there as I start us off with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we can be here and to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word today, that you would inspire us to desire you more in our lives and to be drawn closer to you. Right now, I just also want to lift up the people of Ukraine as this conflict keeps going on. And I just pray that your peace would be with them. And I just pray that there would also be justice put upon the Russian aggressors. But I also pray for the Russian people that a lot of them have been getting a lot of crap for things outside of their control as well. I pray for the common people, and I pray that they would hear your voice and know what you want for us all, and your desires for us to be good to each other and to love each other so that we can love you as well. And I pray that that would be something that would be instilled in all of us. I pray this in the name of your son Jesus. Amen. Okay, so Luke 18. So we're at the point in the book of Luke. Awkward lighting moment. Because what happened was, like, now it's all bright outside. So, like, the light that reflects from the ceiling makes me glow a bit more. But then, of course, I'll have to keep readjusting my lamp in the room as time passes. Because, of course, it's going to start getting dark around, like, 4 or something. So I'll have to turn the lighting in the room back up a bit. But in the meantime, we'll kind of go with this. This should be okay. Anyway, so we're drawing to the end of the, well, not the end of the book of Luke. Book of Luke still has like at least 3 more streams. But with this said, though, we're getting to not just toward the Passion story, but before that, we don't deal so much with stuff Jesus does. Like, he does 1 or 2 more miracles. I think there's really like 1 left, outside of the resurrection, of course. But Jesus won't really do a lot of stuff. At this point, we're at the point where it's a lot more of the stuff Jesus says. And of course, this is important because you have to think of how, from a teaching perspective of leading people to Christianity, for lack of better words, you start off, the opening act, if you will, is all the cool stuff Jesus does, the attractive bits, if you will. It's a really crappy way of wording it, but just work with me here. And so, you do all the more, showy stuff. But as you get into the later part of Luke, and the part that Luke wants to leave with the church, if you will, is a lot of the teachings of Jesus. And of course, naturally, the progress and the psychology behind how the church would behave and how they were to live, not just after Jesus would leave, ascend into heaven and all that, not just after that, but in the context of where the church was at the time. Of course, we haven't read through the book of Acts yet, but basically what is happening by the time Luke writes this is that a lot of the older generation of Christians, if you will, because once again, Christianity wasn't really a thing yet, at least not the way that we know it today. But basically, in order for the faith of the way of Jesus Christ, I guess you could say, that was more accurate of what they were called. The older generation, the first-hand witnesses, you think of, like, if you read through the book of John and the letters of John, for sure, John talks about how John is part of a tradition, along with the other apostles and the earliest believers, that they were part of a tradition that had known Jesus, like, intimately isn't the right word, but they knew Jesus in a very real way, in the sense of, and you read in the letters of John where he talks about how, like, we ate with him, we hung out with him, we've touched his body, we've seen the resurrection, like, physically and all that. But as a lot of the older generation was dying off, some of them being killed off and the other ones, just getting old and die, well then, what do you do? How is the faith to keep going strong well after the earliest believers were gone? Because you can't rely on the cool stuff Jesus does. Because, one, Jesus isn't physically there to do stuff for them. Of course, you read through the book of Acts and the Holy Spirit's doing all kinds of crazy miracles through the apostles and all that. But at the same time, you can't rely on that. I guess is the best way of wording. You can't rely on like the miracles to keep happening. Not to say that miracles don't happen in the world today, but you can't rely on it either. And so, what is the faith to stand on? Well, the simplest way of wording it is the faith will stand on what it has always stood on, the words of God. And so, for the Jews, way beforehand, it was the law and the written history and the chronicles of God's works, as we understand that to be the Old Testament. Of course, it wasn't called that back then. But basically, the Jewish faith survived on the writings, which was the inscriptions of God's word. That's how they looked at the scriptures. In the same way, Christianity would have to make that contingency for itself. And so, as we get to the later part of Luke, we don't focus so much on actions, but rather we focus on words and stuff that is generally spoken. And of course, the book of Luke is the inscription of these words. Of course, once again, Luke himself got this from other people. Other people were writing stuff down, and Luke put them together. Which is why, as we read through the next few chapters, some of the sayings of Jesus will actually feel disconjointed. And there have been a lot of Bible critics that talk about this, and they're right to talk about it. But I think when people criticize when Jesus's lessons kind of are out of order, if you will, and they kind of feel all over the place, it's not that because Jesus was inconsistent in what he taught. That's not true at all. But rather, the writings are just disconjointed because you have to think of it as Luke is compiling a bunch of stuff that the early churches would have had recordings of Jesus' sayings. But of course, at the same time, an important reason that Luke would want to preserve all these is because, once again, the older generation is dying, and you need a kind of centralized, if you will, writings of Jesus' teachings that you can pass on to the churches as, one, Christianity was expanding, and two, in order for Christians in multiple locations to claim that they all believe the same thing, you would need some kind of centralized source teachings, if you will. And of course, that's where the Bible comes in later on for Christians today. But back then, the early Christians would have needed to find some sort of contingency, as well. If you want your religion to keep going, well, you're going to have to do that. You need a contingency. You can't rely on everything being on oral tradition, as many cultures have. Because, of course, oral traditions, you run into other problems, which I've talked about in great length when we talk about the book of Samuel, for instance. There's a lot of problems with relying on oral tradition alone. So that's where we are now. And basically, with that being said, chapters 18 and forward, until we get to the Passion story, it's going to be just Jesus' teachings and stuff that he'll talk about, basically, more than him doing stuff. All right, here we go. Chapter 18. So Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. Jesus said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time the judge refused. But finally he said to himself, 'Ugh, I don't care about God or care about people. Yet because this woman keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, he will find faith on the earth. Now to some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Now 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, one a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. I'm not a robber, an evildoer, adulterer, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I give. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven. But he beat his breast and said, God have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now people were also bringing babies to Jesus for him to place his hands upon them. And when the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. But Jesus called the children to him and said, Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I say to you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God, Verse 17. Truly I say to you, anyone who does not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. Verse 18. A certain ruler asked Jesus, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? Jesus answered, For no one is good except God alone. Now you know the commandments. You shall not commit adultery, shall not commit murder, don't steal, don't give false testimony, honor your father and mother, etc. Well, all these things I have kept since I was a boy, said the ruler. When Jesus heard this, he said to him, You still lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. When the man heard this, he became very sad, because he was very wealthy. Jesus looked at him and said, How hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of God? Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Now those who heard this asked, Who then can be saved? Jesus replied, What is impossible with man is possible with God. And Peter said to him, But we have left everything we had to follow you. Truly I say to you, Jesus said to them, no one who has left home or wife, or brothers or sisters, or parents, or children, for the sake of the kingdom, will fail to receive many times as much in this age, and in the age to come, eternal life. Now Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, We are going to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, spit on him. They will flog, and they will kill him. But on the 3rd day, he will rise again. The disciples did not understand any of it. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they did not know what he was talking about. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. He was sitting on the roadside begging. I don't know why I did that funny accent there. Verse 36. When the beggar heard the crowd going by, he asked, What is happening? And they told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. So the blind man called out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, What do you want me to do for you? Lord, I want to see. Jesus replied, Receive your sight, for your faith has healed you. Immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. And when all the people saw it, they also praised God. All right, so that's chapter 18. Okay, so there's like quite a few like different teachings here, so we got to cover them all. First, we have this short parable about this apathetic judge, if you will. That's the best thing to call him. So we have this apathetic judge. Apathy basically means like you have little care of anything. And it's often associated with like being kind of heartless. And that's kind of this judge. He's kind of a guy who just cares about himself, goes about his own business, doesn't give a damn about anyone. That's the kind of guy this guy is described as. That's what the Bible really means when it says he had no fear of God nor cared what people thought. He was the guy who just doesn't have time to give a shit about anything, is basically what he is. And you know, it's interesting, chapter 18, this parable in chapter 18 is kind of interesting, because I mean, this relates so much with people just in general, especially today. You know, it's no secret to anyone that if you think about like how the social media era, but even before that, you know, people have been generally we've been kind of programmed by society to be somewhat sociopathic, in that we distance ourselves more from people and we tend to be too individualistic, in that we believe what's right because we believe it, and then we kind of just disregard other people's thoughts. That's kind of how many people, especially in like the West, like North America and Europe, that's generally how people are raised to think. And now you have a lot of people just kind of, you know, what works for you, but I want to live my life my way, right? That's kind of how people live today. You know, Frank Sinatra's famous, I did it my way. And, you know, there's some merit in that, because, you know, it's because of us being human beings, it's impossible to care too much about what everyone else feels, because that would just exhaust you to no end. And that's not healthy. But at the same time, of course, the double-edged sword is that now people have become too apathetic. We've been doing things our own way for so long, we kind of allowed that to put blinders on where we should have more humanity. Thinking about the Ukraine crisis is a good example of this, because, you know, this conflict's still going. It's been like 3 weeks now. 3 weeks? I think it's like 3 weeks now. And a lot of the talk of it has kind of died down a bit. You don't see it on like the front pages anymore, because a lot of people have kind of like, okay, yeah, we know that they're suffering or whatever. But of course, a lot of people want to get back to their own lives. But at the same time, it's like you can't ignore the fact that people are suffering. And so you know, there's that weird paradigm that we have, whether, you know, we should be caring about people who are suffering, like the people in Ukraine, but at the same time, here we are in North America, and we think, well, that's the other side of the world. You know, I can't be too much bothered to think about that. And so that tends to happen quite a bit. And of course, that that's just a mild example of the fact that we've become a lot more apathetic in our culture. But you think of social media. Social media is like that, but cranked up to like 12 and a half dials. So, in with social media, it's way worse. People are way more apathetic and borderlining like psychotic on social media because there's just this high. It's a high value of North American culture of the individual not caring about what other people think, etc., etc. But then, of course, on social media, where people can use the screen to shield themselves from criticism, then people use that to be not just apathetic, but even hostile toward things that they don't like or agree with. And so you think of the apathetic judge in this story, and he's kind of, well, he's not to that extreme, obviously, but that apathy, the nature of that apathy is there, that he's a person who doesn't really care about much. And it's funny where Jesus points out that he has no fear of God. And so the, that very much describes the world today. There's a very low, quote unquote, fear of God. Of course, I know many people, when they hear the word fear, they naturally think of like, well, you shouldn't be afraid of God. Although, once again, I mean, you have to take the Old Testament into context here when Jesus uses this language. And it's funny that a lot of people miss this little detail where in the Old Testament, as well as the early parts of the New Testament, basically pre-resurrection, fear of God is an often used expression. And part of this, now here's a weird educational tangent about one of the things that made Christianity pretty out there as a belief system, was that in Christianity, they added an extra day of worship, and that was on Sunday. Now, there's two reasons for this. The obvious reason, and the more sociological reason, is that since the early Christians were primarily Jews, they still maintained a lot of the Jewish faith because in their minds, Christianity was just an add-on to Judaism. And as many Christians would correctly point out, that Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism. So if it was the fulfillment, then that means the old stuff was still valid. Therefore, Saturday Sabbath practices were still valid. And so on your Saturday, if you were an early Christian in Jerusalem, on your Saturday you would go to the synagogue or the temple if you were one of the lucky people in Jerusalem. You would go to the synagogue and do your Torah reading and your scroll reading and all that stuff and have your regular Jewish kind of Saturday. But at the same time, the Christians also wanted to, well, worship Jesus because of the whole conquering death and cleansing us of our sin. So they wanted a day for that, and so they moved it to the next day. Now, of course, in Jewish thought, it would be Sunday to Friday were your work days, and Saturday was your Sabbath. But the psychology of Christians really wanted to put the day of worship on the first day of the week, the first work day. Now, the theological reason, which leads to reason two, of why Christianity made this big move, instead of just just doing worship on Saturday, and then just changing the regular synagogue day. One, because, well, you can't just do that because there were a lot of Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, and you would have a lot of problems. After all, technically, Christianity was, in the earliest days, considered a Jewish cult, and the Jewish people would have considered them a cult. But anyway, the other reason, too, was that the psychology of Christians was very different from not just the Jews, but from most other religions. And this is where I know this is going to be a bit of a hot take, but most religions are mostly associated, and to be fair to the atheists' credit, is why they're so wary of religions in general. And is that most religions are kind of overly death focused, and in a way like a death cult. Most religions are. Because, of course, there's a lot of emphasis on the afterlife. And not just that, but there's a huge emphasis on the afterlife, and of course the need of fearing the gods in older religions. And that shows up in Judaism as well, to an extent. And, you know, if you've watched my Book of Exodus study, you know why the Jews obviously thought of, like, their belief system as a death cult. There's obvious reasons for that. But with Christianity, their psychology changed quite a bit. And they started thinking, no, we don't look at the death cult aspects of our belief system, but rather we focus on the life aspects, primarily because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so when you move your day of rest from the end of the week to you put your day of worship on the beginning of the week, being Sunday, the idea is not that, oh, we work and then we come to an end, but rather Jesus lives, therefore we live. And that was the change of psychology. And that was why it's kind of funny to word it this way, but when the early Christians moved their primary day of worship from Saturday, the Sabbath, to Sunday, the first day of the week, that was considered a very highly heretical move. So yeah, by definition, Christians are very heretical. I mean, if you compare them to, say, Jews, Muslims, etc. It's also a reason why, if you actually think about it, Jews and Muslims actually share that in common, is that they have a massive hatred for Christians, because Christians are extremely heretical in their belief system compared to what Jews and Muslims believe. And putting your worship on Sunday was one of those huge heretical moves. Now you're probably wondering, what the hell does this have to, why am I talking about this in regards to the apathetic judge story? Well, this expression of the fear of God was something that every ancient world religion understood. And so this judge, he appears to be a very different kind of person than if he doesn't follow the old religious mindset. I mean, you could call him a proto-atheist, if even that. Because, of course, there's the other thing, too, about, like, atheism. Atheism isn't a new concept. It's been around since forever. As long as people have had religions with gods, atheism has also existed to counter that. I mean, you think of, like, the earliest days of Buddhism. Buddhism is also the earliest school of Buddhism. I think I'm going to butcher this. I know some Indian person's going to come in here and say it's actually pronounced. But Theravada Buddhism, which is the oldest school of Buddhism, is actually a form of atheism. It's a philosophy that denies the will of the gods and even questions their existence in general. Because, of course, when Siddhartha became enlightened, he was challenging a lot of the notions of Hinduism of his time. And so he greatly challenged them, and even questioned the validity of claiming that the gods existed. And so, in the same way, talking about, like, there were people who were possibly atheists in first century Israel is no stretch of the imagination, because as long as there are religions that believe there are gods, there will always be people who don't believe that gods exist. And that could be applied to this apathetic judge. But the interesting thing, with that being said, and coming back to the parable now, the interesting thing is, despite this, the guy thinks realistically, the apathetic judge. And what's interesting is that Jesus uses this guy as an illustration of how much greater God's justice is, because we have this apathetic judge, possibly atheist judge, who still can perform justice, despite that. Okay, the underlying implication is that if you don't believe in God, then you can't believe in, like, divine justice. Now, many atheists will obviously challenge that notion, but just work with what the text says here. And Jesus is basically saying, well, even if there's this atheist guy who doesn't believe in divine justice, can still live as if he does and performs justice for this widow. He still does it, even though he may not believe in it. Then Jesus turns it around and says, well, how much more would God give you justice? So if a guy who doesn't believe in real justice can perform justice, because here's the shocking thing Jesus is kind of implying here: justice exists on an objective level. And if this apathetic judge can perform this justice, then how much more can God do? Now, with that being said, I know this parable sounds like a lot like other parables that we've read already, where God or Jesus makes a comparison between God and normal humans and talk about how if normal humans can do something good, then how much more can God do? How much more good can God do? If normal humans who are either wicked, like in the earlier story about the the sinful fathers who can still treat their kids pretty well, and then Jesus makes a comparison between sinful fathers and God as the perfect father. And then, of course, now we have in chapter 18 here that kind of same notion with this apathetic judge. And that's that sounds almost like an oxymoron. A judge cannot be apathetic. A judge must, well, at least care for justice. At the very least, he can't be like unfeeling. A judge has to at least believe in justice. So, if an apathetic judge can perform justice, then how much more can God perform justice? Is kind of what Jesus is kind of just saying. And this is meant to be like a hopeful thing, because let's look at the world today. There's a lot of injustice that happens, and I know a lot of people, they bring up the theophany question about, oh, if God is so good, why does he let bad things happen, blah 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 blah. Oh, why do bad things happen? Why doesn't God bring immediate punishment to the bad people, blah 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 blah. Well, there's a lot of answers to those questions, but we don't need to go too deep in that now. But as far as Luke 18 is concerned, what it does say is that God will ultimately bring justice to us all. God will ultimately bring justice to us all. Is kind of what Jesus is telling with the story of the apathetic judge. Because even an apathetic judge can bring justice. And so how much more can God do? What's interesting is that, many people tend to preach this next part, the next parable I'm going to talk about. They tend to preach this part on its own, and to be fair, it can be its own set of sermons, if you will. I've even preached on this sermon. And that's this little parable about a tax collector and a Pharisee. Now, people tend to preach this part on its own, but you can actually easily see how this story relates to the previous saying. After all, I did that whole spiel about justice and how much God believes in justice, if you will. How much Jesus believes in justice. And so the next parable is very interesting when you have that whole justice thing in your head. And then you read this next parable where it's about these two guys, a Pharisee and a tax collector. They go up to the temple, hypothetically, and they're praying. And we have the Pharisee, and he's talking about how great he is, basically, about how like, oh, I'm not like all these bad people, which is a very dangerous way to think. And once again, I'm gonna quote it again from the play Wicked. Those who claim to be evil are not that much worse than the rest of us, but those who claim to be good are the ones you must be wary of. And this Pharisee, he would be one of those, right? He claiming how great he is. But you got to be wary of people like that. But then we have the tax collector who just acknowledges that he's a broken, sinful man and just say like, I'm not worthy to face God. But of course, Jesus brings out in this parable of what is the most important thing. And where does that justice come from, and how God will judge us accordingly? Because of course, with justice comes there needs to be judging, which I think is one of those things that people tend to misconstrue when they talk about like, oh, Christianity is such a judging religion, which there is some truth in that statement. I mean, to be fair, every religion judges. To be fair, any kind of philosophy judges people. It has to. And the reason why every religion and every philosophy has to judge people is because any kind of ethics, any kind of belief system that desires to also have ethics, ethics in themselves require judging, because ethics have to be compared to something else. Ethics do not exist in a vacuum. So what do I mean by this? Well, basically the way to view what ethics are. I mean, what even are ethics? Ethics is the right way to behave. Well, if there's a right way to behave, there must obviously be wrong ways to behave. And every religion and belief system has these. It has to have them, because otherwise, if you just did whatever they wanted, then you would have anarchy. But anarchy is the bane of all people. You know, just read the Analects. The Analects is all about why it's so important for people to have ethics. For those of you who don't know what the Analects are, the Analects is just is the actual word, the actual title of the writings of Confucius. For those of you who don't know who that is, well, I got bad news for you, but you might have to go back to grade school if you don't know who Confucius is. But anyway, let's use Confucius as the example. A big part of his writings was all about the necessity of ethics. And of course, there's a lot of his writings are dedicated to what makes good ethics. But a part of the Analytics talks about why it's important to have ethics. And to be fair, once again, he's not the only one to talk about this. He's just one of the, I guess he's just famous for being an early writer of these kind of things. Because, you know, we have Socrates, who comes quite a bit later than Confucius. Confucius is like way back. He's like super old. So Confucius may be like earliest, but once again, it's one of those things where like ethics has always been a concern of every society. I mean, technically, you could read the laws of the Old Testament as a form of ethics. But of course, with that said, ethics require judgment, because you have to compare them to something else. There has to be some kind of benchmark, if you will, of what is acceptable in your society and what not, which is the purpose of ethics. So in the same way, all right, I heard you. Anyway, in the same way, with every system needing to judge people, well then, how do we live, I guess you could say, with that in mind, that like, oh, everything I do can and will be judged? Of course, there are two ways of going about this. There's the very strict rules must be followed. You do not break the rules, because if you do, you will be heavily punished. And of course, those are, you know, people associate that with very authoritarian kind of nations. You think of your, you know, your fascist groups, or, well, fascism is not even the best illustration. Fascism obviously utilizes it. But even in most, like, very closed societal groups, gatekeeping is a form of a stricter kind of form of ethics and judging system. Gatekeeping is a form of that. So basically, with what gatekeeping is, and an easy example is like gamers and gaming gatekeeping, where like, oh, what, you know, you believe and do certain things And when you do them, then you are considered a real gamer. That's what gatekeeping basically is. And so every kind of, and if you don't follow those gatekeeping rules, you get judged very heavily as not being a real gamer, not part of the gaming community. And that's true with all kinds of belief systems. Of course, the other way of going about it is to just try and rewrite the rules and say, like, no, everything is permissible. But then, of course, then if everything becomes permissible, going back to the the gamer gatekeeping thing, you run into all kinds of problems. We use gamer gatekeeping as our example here when we talk about judging people. So if you go the first route of saying like the much more strict, rigid gatekeeping definition of what makes a gamer community, it's like that means, okay, so by definition, I might not make it because I'm not like super hardcore gamer, but I play quite a bit. You guys do know that enough because I've been playing some games on this channel, and I play a fair amount of games on here. So you could say I'm a gamer. I play a lot of games, and I like a lot of games, and I own enough systems to be a gamer. I own a computer, a Switch, and so I think that's enough. And my phone technically counts as a gaming system. But that's where we get into, the more rigid rules. Well, does phone game, if a person only plays phone games, does it count? Well, a gatekeeper might say, not really, because you're not really engaged in like gamer culture and having like part of a fandom. But then if you try to go on the other side, you try to rewrite the rules, then everybody's a gamer, because technically my mom is a gamer because she plays like slots on her phone from time to time. She just plays like, slot games. So my mom counts as a gamer, but a gamer might not view myself and then versus like my mom as the same type of gamers. Because my mom wouldn't say she's a gamer, but if you try to say like, well, if you play a video game, then you're a gamer, then technically everybody is. And so my mom would count, but at the same time, if you go the gatekeeper route, well, my mom would not be. And that's because she would also frown upon like all the total nerds who are part of gaming culture and stuff like that. And so where is that fine line of what do you judge as like, okay, a real gamer kind of thing? And that's where gatekeeping kind of is a necessity. In the same way, the way that religions set up rules and then they judge according to those rules, well, it kind of works in the same way. Hence, this is also why technically everything can be a religion, because every kind of community does this. And to be fair, it's because that's just part of human nature. Humans do that. Humans judge other humans because, of course, it's one way to see like, are you and this other person like compatible working together and existing in the same community? That's a very important question. And I mean, we don't think about that so much in the modern era, but that was definitely a big deal back in the ancient times. Anyway, I detracted there quite a bit. So going back to the apathetic judge and transitioning into this story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, well, there's that kind of judging aspect here, and of course, what Jesus is trying to get at here is the way God judges people. So the first parable, the one with the apathetic judge, Jesus is making the point that if apathetic people can judge correctly, then how much more can God judge people and bring proper justice? That's basically what Jesus is getting at. With that said, we move to the next parable with the tax collector and the Pharisee. And the Pharisee, he's the guy that's like, oh, I'm so great. I'm not a bad person. I do all the proper thing. I fast twice a week. I give my tithes. I don't steal people's wives and all that stuff. I do all the right things. But apparently, what does God really care for? Well, we learn about that in the tax collector's prayer. The tax collector just confesses that he's a sinner. And then Jesus makes the note that it is a tax collector who is justified for being honest about his life and accepting that he's a person who's broken, who has sin in his life and needs help from it. And that is the kind of thing Jesus looks for in people. That accountability is the fancy word everybody uses. Accountability. And honesty in the tax collector. Which I know leads to the big problem. Because, we live in this era where it's so easy to look down on people who have problems. We tend to think of ourselves as like we're the elite people, and the more your life is put together, that means like you're a better person and yada yada yada, which is of course not how God intended things to be. People should not look down on other people like that. But that's also just a natural way people think. People tend to think that, well, if your life is more put together, that means you are a better person because one, you manage your life better and all that. But of course, there's a lot of different dimensions that you have to address, like what do people do behind closed doors and whatnot. I mean, you think of stuff like, Me Too, as old as that is, was a good example of that. What were people, like behind closed doors, and was there a lot of this kind of shifty, women abuse? And as we move further and further along, more people are getting outed for doing, all these awful things. And it's not, once again, part of it is that whole like be wary of people who claim to be good. So there's that. And unfortunately, I know that sounds mega terrible when you say it out loud, but women will fall for that very often. Women fall for that more than men do. At least that's how it appears. Once again, this may not necessarily be true, but at least in the industries, like high-end industries like movies and stuff like that, the entertainment industry and stuff like that, it appears that women fall for this more than men do. So I'm using that as my observation. Once again, this is not like 100% the case, but from what I observe, it makes sense that, of course, you have these powerful men who deceive women and say that, well, actually, I'm a good guy. I'm actually good. I'm not like all these bad guys out there. And then those guys end up taking advantage of women and, to several extremes. Even, not going to say it on air because I don't want to get in trouble. But you know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, it's the whole like, there were tons of controversies about like the quote unquote male feminists is a good example. We can make fun stabs at those. So, I mean, I've seen these kind of things firsthand, and the way that I've known women who've fallen for male feminists, and they end up being hurt quite a bit. And half of me wants to go like, well, I told you so. But the other half of me is just like, no, I will support you, and screw these guys who are complete assholes. But you think about like the male feminist thing as an example, and why a lot of them end up being like sexual predators, and why women fall for it so often. Now I know that part's the hot take, that women fall for it pretty often, but obviously you kind of have to make a correlation here, that if there's so many male feminists that are sexual predators, the implication is that they have to be successful in order to be proven that they're sexual predators. So you have to bear with my logic here, and why my other statement, I stand by my other statement, is that I tend to observe that women fall for it pretty often. The male feminist trap. So it's because there's this danger of guys who are like, oh no, I'm actually harmless. And they say all the rhetoric about like being equal pay for men and women, and being like, oh, against the patriarchy, and against male dominant religions, and not being like that dumbass Asian guy who plays video games and can justify it while being a pastor. That guy's an idiot. So clearly, you got to choose the guy who claims he's all right, as opposed to the other, the Asian guy who, justifies playing video games while being a pastor. Like, that guy's clearly an idiot. So, and it's so easy. You stop that. Hang on. Sorry, give me a sec here. She's like, her claw is stuck in like a part of, like, is there a claw there? She's like pulling on a thing on my pants, and it's kind of irritating. Sorry. Anyway, so I don't know why I'm bringing so much. Like, I guess it's because it's a very important thing. Maybe I'll do a podcast on this one day, but because I can keep talking about this idea about how dangerous it is for people who claim to be good, but then they end up being some of the most dangerous people. And the male feminist is a clear example. That's a clear example we can just use. And so, going back to the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, well, you have to be careful of, the guys who claim to be good, but at the same time, what Jesus tells in this story is that the people who claim that are the reason why they're so dangerous. This is where I was going. The reason why those people are so dangerous is because they don't admit that they have evil in themselves. And if you don't admit that you have your inner demons to fight, then you can do all kinds of atrocities and justify it as part of the greater good, which is extremely dangerous. And so, why is the tax collector the one who's justified, as Jesus says at the end of this parable? Is because he's willing to face his inner demons. But the interesting thing, and this is, the hot take, if you will, is that unfortunately in our society, especially in North America, we try to skirt away from that. And this is where we try to have laws change and try to suggest that all the wrongdoings we do are actually not that bad, yada, 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 because we don't want to face our inner demons. And on the one hand, there's the compassionate side of me says, well, no one wants to fight their inner demons, because to be fair, your inner demons are very powerful. They will hurt you when you have to confront them. And going back to the it's one of those things that, like, I understand where people criticize when Christians say, like, oh, we have to confess our sins, and some Christians treat it like it's a light deal. It's like, no, it is not. Confessing your sins is it takes a lot of strength, because when you have to face that you are a sinner, it is not easy, and it will hurt you. It will hurt you. It is not, it might hurt you. It will hurt you. And it will hurt others. That's just the way it is. But that's the truth of sin. Sin does damage to everything it touches. And if we all have sin in our lives, well, it obviously damages us because it's in your life. And secondly, anyone you interact with, your sinful natures can come out and hurt people. And so, when you have to face that and confess those things in yourself toward God, that's a painful and difficult thing. And, no one wants to subjugate themselves to pain. So I understand. It's understanding why, okay, people don't want to confront sin because it's tough. But at the same time, the reality is you must. And there's that problematic paradox. I mean, Christianity is full of those, I guess. But that's another problematic paradox, is that we must face our sinful nature and overcome them. And, master them even. But at the same time, that's extremely difficult, and it is more likely your sinful nature will master you. This is one of those things that, like, it's one of those weird-ass ambiguous readings when we read in, like, Genesis, where God tells people to master their sin, and you're like, what the hell does that even mean? And to be fair, that's a very strange, that's a very strange idea, to master, the sin lurking inside of you. But, of course, and this is where a lot of people are often skeptical that, like, Jesus washes our sins. It's like, that seems too good to be true, and that's an understandable, criticism, and, to question. It can't be that easy. And, there's truth in that too, because it's not that easy. And I think that's the weird tension that we have to deal with, because on the one hand, Jesus promises that he will forgive us, and cleanse us of sin and give us the power to overcome it. But at the same time, you still have to confront your sin, and that is not easy. That is a very difficult thing. It takes a lot of power to do that. But at the same time, that is what God looks for in all of us, that we have that power, if you will, to face our sin. And then Jesus, the Christian promise is that Jesus will take care of the rest. You just have to be willing to face it. And so that's where we get to. Now we come back to the story. I know I went on this long tirade here, but you done yet? You done? You done? Okay. Anyway, so on the one hand, it's required that we are to be judged, but at the same time is what are you judged for? And the big misconception that generally exists is that, you're judged for the good and bad things you've done in your life, which is much more old religion thinking. Because you think of like Egyptian religion. That's how they thought. There was the scales of, crap, what are they actually called? Basically, and American justice system has kind of adopted this as well. This idea of there's the scales of like your good deeds and your bad deeds, and they kind of weigh against each other. And if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, then you're proven innocent. Excuse me, in the American system and in the old Egyptian religious mindset, if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, then you get to go into the after. You get to go into the good part of the afterlife, or you go to the bad place. And so, talk about scales. You can tell where I got this analogy from. But anyway, so the scales of conviction have spoken. But anyway, back in all seriousness, this kind of, that was the old way of thinking, with the scale system. But what Jesus is talking about here, it's actually a lot. It's on the one hand simpler, but also more demanding, if that makes sense. So Jesus talks about how, how is a person judged? They're judged by the strength of character to face their sins. But see, that sounds easier than this whole like good and evil kind of scales thing. But then you run into the problem of this idea of having the strength to face your sins. Well, that is super hard. Doing good and weighing good and bad deeds in a person's life is pretty easy. You say, okay, this guy, he doesn't beat his wife, he works hard, takes care of his kids. Okay, we put a bunch of value on the good scale. Oh, but he's also kind of a dickbag to his coworker. He's, cheats his taxes a little bit. Has some more conservative, well, I guess if you cheat your taxes, you're not conservative. But like, maybe doesn't like animals, put it on the bad scale, and then just weigh it. Like, that sounds easy to do. And we do that. That's an inherent human nature thing, is that we kind of put people's lives on, balancing scales. Whereas God's criteria, he really has a much more straightforward one, is, do you have the strength to face your dark side? But at the same time, that is a way more difficult thing to do, to face your dark side, to battle your inner demons. But in this story, coming back to the story now, that is the thing God looks for, because that is ultimately what matters. Now, of course, I'm not saying that like the good and bad you do in life doesn't or does not matter. That's not what I'm getting at. But what I am getting at is those things, as important as they don't define who you are. The good and bad things you do, because once again, people change. You can believe one thing one day and change completely the next day. People do that. But as far as facing your sinful nature, well, that's a continual battle that you have to choose to do, and you have to have the strength to do it. And to be fair, that ain't easy. I mean, hell, it's anything but easy. But it is the thing that God requires from us. because good and bad deeds can, they come and go. You do good things, you do bad things in life all the time. But do you have the strength to face the excuse me, the evil inside you? Do you have the strength to face that? But of course, with that said, this is where a lot of people misinterpret those passages where Jesus talks about like, oh, I'll always be with you. I'll, be there to comfort you in your times of trial and all that. Of course, it does apply to outward things like hardships you go through in life. That obviously applies to that. But when Jesus talks about, he would never abandon his people and whatnot, a big part of it is how we face our inner demons, because it is something we must all do. And to battle that sinful nature. But it is that God cares about. And as we see in the tax collector, it is the one who has the courage to face that is the one who is justified. Of course, the extension of logic, because I can't stop. I know some people would be dissatisfied if I stop there. Of course, in the Christian mindset, it is when you face that darkness in yourself is what leads you to faith in Christ. But of course, it's kind of it's one of those things that like it's kind of an all or nothing thing, where the implication of once you truly admit of fighting that sinful evil nature in yourself, that leads you to faith in Christ at some point. And of course, the thing I would say is that it doesn't have to be like an immediate one-to-one. Like, it's not like as soon as you're facing your inner demons, you immediately become a Christian. It doesn't happen like that. But, there is that process has clearly started. And Jesus is anything if not patient. And so he will wait for that day of you coming to faith. And that's kind of what's implied in the tax collector story. Because the tax collector doesn't say, like, I'm a believer all of a sudden. Like, it doesn't say that. But he's already on the road. And that's what matters. All right, I spent a lot of time talking about the first half of this chapter, so we're just gonna skip the thing about the little children part because it's kind of self-explanatory. It's like you have to have that wide-eyed wonder. I'll just talk about it briefly. I talked about this in a previous stream, but basically when Jesus talks about accepting the kingdom like a little child, I know a lot of people find that verse kind of weird because the thing most people, this is why people hate kids. But most people, what is the thing that most people associate with children? It's like naivete, brattiness, fair amount of stupidity. But one thing that you should associate with children, one of the more positive aspects of children that tends to be lost as you become an adult, is the wide-eyed wonder. And to be fair, that's why kids ask stupid questions. It's because they have this wide-eyed wonder and want to know about, well, everything. Of course, one of the problems is that, like, Christian parents are guilty of this. Is when their kids ask, controversial questions. A lot of Christian parents, the sheltering kinds anyway, they would be quick to dismiss those kind of questions. But at the same time, it's that wide-eyed wonder of a child that allows them to grow and flourish. And if nurtured well, the child can be led to greatness, kind of thing. And so when Jesus talks about accepting the kingdom of God like a little child, I think that's what Jesus is really getting at more, is the more wide-eyed aspect of it. Because I think that wide-eye explorative nature of children is a high virtue. And it's something that, like, part of it, we naturally grow out of it as adults, because as adults, we get so concerned with life, and not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just part of life. You have to deal with a whole bunch of different things. Working to make money, family, etc. You have to worry about those things. So you don't get the opportunity to be a wide-eyed explorer. But of course, there's a lot of people who will talk about how like life is a continual learning process. And that's something that you always have as a kid, and that's the wide-eyed wonder of children once again. And that's how I understand when Jesus talks about accepting the kingdom like a little kid. Because that's what Jesus is getting at. He cares that we are continuously searching and ultimately searching for him. But that's kind of implied. But the idea is that, we have to have that wide-eye wonder. Because, of course, that also leads to a more flourishing life, which is what God desires in us. He desires us to have life and life to the fullest. John 10:10, right? But that's what I think Jesus means when he talks about accepting the kingdom like a child, and not the negative connotations people tend to associate with, like, don't accept the kingdom of heaven with naivete, because that is kind of doesn't make sense and is actually bad in general. There, make her go away. Reverse psychology right there. Made the cat go away. I hope she didn't bite me too hard. She was like, ah. Anyway, moving on to a couple more things. So we have this guy, a certain ruler asks Jesus story, and the guy says, well, what must I do to have eternal life? And basically, the TLDR is Jesus tells him to sell his possessions. And then the guy goes away all sad because he was wealthy. And then Jesus uses the famous line, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Once again, there's that contrast of people who think they have it all versus the people who know that they need God. And it's one of those passages that, like, I know this passage is often quoted very often, especially nowadays, because, if you live in North America in the 21st century, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on, COVID and all that, and other things too, social class problems and crap like that. But if you are honest with yourself and you look at the wider perspective of the world, and you think of how comfortable your life is in the grand scheme of not just the world today, but like through history, like we have it so good in the 21st century. We have it so good. Thank God for modern technology and modern medicine, modern cooking, and like eating out in the world today is amazing. Right? We have it so good today. We have it so good today. And with that being said, it's easy to say that basically we are all rich in Canada. I mean, here's a bold statement. If you have a smartphone with a plan, you are a rich person. I don't care if you live in some shitty ass, dumpy ass shack like I do, or you live in a high end Malibu house. The fact is, even people who don't have that much money, if you have a smartphone with a good phone plan, you're a rich person by definition. Because I mean, I've talked about this in like my old podcast about knowledge. You have the whole world in the palm of your hand. Like, if that's not wealth, I don't know what is. But with that said, I think it makes the statement of Jesus here in chapter 18 more true. And when you have that much power, it's so easy to forget God and to kind of believe you just do things your own way or whatever. And with that said, though, that makes Jesus' statement all the more true. It's so hard and that's why there's so much antagonism toward Christianity and the gospel today. Because if people have as much power as they do, then people feel like, well, I don't need God when they have as much power as they do, And it is silly to think that, like, yeah, a cell phone can do all that, but it can. We have so much more power in the palm of our hand compared to, you think of like the rest of the world for starters, and then you think of like 20 years ago, this wasn't possible. And I was alive 20 years ago, so like I know the difference. I understand that difference. Not just because I was a kid back then and I'm an adult now, but like you think of like how smartphones have changed the world. And I mean, you don't even need to go that far. That's just like a mega modern hot take. Well, not even a hot take, really. But I know some people may think it's a hot take, but the fact of the matter is, like, no. If you live in the world, if you live in the 21st century, you have a smartphone with a decent phone plan, you're super rich. You are the 1% of economic wealth. Because, and not just economic wealth, but, knowledge and all forms of other power too, and the things that you have access to. You have all that, so you are by definition rich. But with that said, with so many of us being rich, I think Jesus' statement is it rings so much more true. How hard is it for a rich person to enter heaven? And if so many of us are rich, and you can see there's a high correlation of, not that I'm blaming cell phones, so I'm not going to say it's a causation, but there's a high correlation of why people tend to be even more against like the need of God and the lack of the fear of God kind of thing. It's so much more evident now because of the power that we possess at the the palm of your hand. And so I think that statement's really true, even more so today. And I mean, you guys know this. Anyone who's honest with themselves would realize this pretty quickly. Holy crap, sorry, 4:30. I need to get a move on here. Alright, so Jesus predicts his death again in Luke 18. I think it's the last time he does. Like, he outright predicts it. I mean, there's technically, like, Jesus does talk more about it, but he doesn't really do so much as, like, this is gonna happen. But rather, he talks about his impending death, like, now that it's here, this is how you ought to live. Of course, I'm talking about stuff like the Last Supper discourse in the book of John, for instance. So he doesn't, in that instance, he doesn't predict his death per se, even though he clearly talks about it. But rather, he talks in the Last Supper discourse more of a, now that I am going to be taken away from you, this is how you ought to live kind of thing. So I wouldn't count that as a Jesus predicts his death. But in Luke 18 here, you could say this is the last time he actually talks about, like, quote unquote, predicting his death, saying that, okay, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die there. He did this a couple of times. He does it 3 times in the book of Luke. We already covered the other 2 times. And Luke 18 just points out he does it a 3rd time. I don't really need to say much about it because it's kind of like, oh, duh, we've already exhausted this topic. So we're going to move on past that. Finally, the last part of chapter 18, we have a miracle. Yeah. So for a while, Jesus does this all talk, and then he actually does something for a change here. Even though, once again, it's kind of like, it's not frequent, but we get to see something here. And basically, we have this blind man who is basically healed of his sight. But the interesting thing about this particular story is how it links to the Jesus predicting his death earlier. I mean, just a few verses earlier. So, once again, I've talked about this quite a bit as well, where Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And, of course, one of the hilarious ironies in the Bible is that the Son of God is not a divine title, because technically everyone is. And, we read in the book of Luke, the early parts of the book of Luke, where when Luke does the genealogy, and he goes all the way back to Adam being the Son of God, the idea is that he's inverting that traditional understanding of Son of God and Son of Man. So the Son of God title is not a divine title at all. It's something that belongs to all people. If Adam is the Son of God, and technically all humans come from Adam, therefore everybody is the Son of God. So therefore, or child of God, okay, be more gender, open about that. Everyone's a child of God. Which that means it's not really a special title, because that means everyone's a child of God, so whatever, right? If everybody's special, nobody's special. Isn't that how Sindro says it in The Incredibles? But anyway, but the Son of Man title is a divine title. And of course, I've talked about this in great length earlier in the in earlier Luke readings when Jesus first starts using that term. And of course, the Son of Man refers to the book of Daniel. And one of the funniest, parts about it is when you read the book of Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus. Well, of course, you have these Zoroastrian astrologers come and see Jesus because they understood the book of Daniel and they were like, I want to meet the guy who calls God God. I want to meet that guy. So that's basically the Son of Man title is associated with is the is the is the person that God, the Ancient of Days, calls God, which I know sounds really weird when you say it out loud, but you just gotta roll with it. And so the Zoroastrian mages in the book of Matthew, they wanted to see. They were basically, like, I want to see this guy. I want to meet the guy who God calls God because, of course, there's the Zoroastrian in the Middle East. They were the predominant monotheistic religion, and they were for the longest time. But anyway, as very well Melchizedek, as we read in Genesis, may very well be an early priest of Zoroastrianism. That's popular belief, and I don't see much of an objection to that. But anyway, going back to Luke 18, though, Jesus once again uses the Son of Man title, so he's using the divine title based off the book of Daniel. And so there's one, the whole, like, he's calling himself God, so there's that. And two, the ascension process. And so this is one of the other things I didn't cover when we talked about the Son of Man title earlier, because I didn't feel like we needed to. And it's more relevant as we get closer to the Passion story anyway. But basically, if you recall in the book of Daniel, which I did not read on stream, you'll have to do that reading on your own. Basically, what happens, as Daniel describes it, is that there's this process, if you will, where the Son of Man appears before God and the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days is like, all right, God, you will become, the name of which everyone worships and all that, and you will be elevated to this high status, and you will be a power unlike any other. Da 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 da. And so from that was birthed a lot of messianic kind of talk. People talk about the Messiah coming, and so when that, because of the book of Daniel and other people's like mythological kind of assumptions with a divine being like the Son of Man, they all think this ascension process is going to be like something awesome, like the Son of Man is going to come and just kick some major ass and then be on the throne of David forever. That was the original thought. And so the early Jews of this time, the first century Jews, I shouldn't call them early Jews, first century Jews were thinking that, oh man, when the Messiah comes, it's going to be like some major ass whooping against the Romans, and then the king of the throne of David will be reestablished. It's going to be awesome. And that will be the ascension. That makes sense for an ascension process. I mean, how else do people's names get carved into history? By being awesome. But that's not what Jesus talks about here. He says something very different. He says, well, the Son of Man will be put in the hands of Gentiles, spat upon, flogged, and then killed. Which sounds ridiculous, right? Because, of course, once again, the first century Jews were thinking like, no, man, the Messiah is gonna free us from all these people. We will no longer be under the thumb of the dirty people. We're gonna be, Israel will be in a new golden age. And so with that comes like, the Messiah's got to do something awesome. That's what you think. But Jesus says that's not what's going to happen. The ascension process is not a physical one, but as we will see, not just a spiritual one either, but a meta kind of metaphysical, meta-spiritual kind of ascension. You might want to, by the way, actually write that part down about this meta-physical, meta-spiritual ascension, because I will come back to that in great detail. I mean, for those of you, like, you should know where I'm going with this, but for educational purposes, you might want to keep note of that because I will talk about that in great detail later. Not today's stream, obviously, but I will come back to this whole ascension, the metaphysical and metaspiritual ascension thing with the Son of Man later. Now, I brought that up because now we get to this blind beggar story. The blind beggar story is kind of interesting. It's like, okay, it's the first miracle Jesus has done in a while. But it's not so much the miracle that's the interesting part of the story. It's the conversation. Well, not conversation. It's the confession, if you will, of the blind beggar. So the blind beggar, he calls when he hears that Jesus of Nazareth is coming. And it's interesting that the Bible words it this way. So obviously, as I talked about in the past, that's what he would have been known as. He would have been Jesus of Nazareth. And so, he's got some notoriety. And when that name is heard, it's interesting what the blind beggar starts referring to him as. He calls him Son of David. Now, I mean, you got to see where this is going now. When he starts referring to him as the Son of David, he's thinking of this messianic movement and this divine ascension thing. That's what he's thinking. And to be fair, part of that might just be like flattering Jesus so that he would get his miracle done. Because, I mean, to be fair, the blind guy wants to see, so can't really argue with that ulterior motive if that is the case. I mean, any blind person that heard that Jesus of Nazareth was coming would probably do that. So you can't be too harsh on this guy if that was his ulterior motive. But basically, this guy, he calls him out as the Son of David. And so this is an interesting contrast because Jesus just talked about the Son of Man needing to die. But at the same time, we have this blind beggar referring to the Son of Man in this ascended form. If that, I know that sounds so anime when I say it like that. But like, in this, he addresses him in this ascended form. And of course, that's to kind of, well, one, just stroke Jesus' ego if the guy wanted to get his healing miracles, I've already mentioned. But at the same time, it really shows this kind of the mind of where people were expecting the Messiah and soon. That the Messiah is coming. And to be fair, when we talk about Jesus predicting his death, he didn't like publicly say this. He was kind of talking to his disciples about this. So the common people don't know. They don't know that Jesus continuously predicting his death. So the common people are thinking that the ascension of the Messiah is near. And so this blind beggar, he speaks to Jesus as if it is already a thing. And Jesus says your faith is what heals you. Of course, the ironic twist is not this military ass whooping thing that Jesus does, but the resurrection, which is his ascension thing. So, but the interesting thing to read here in chapter 18 is, this ascension talk of, the Son of Man claiming his place, if you will. And of course, you gotta read that in line with like the book of Daniel. This coming time is approaching. That's how the people are treating it. That's another reason why like Jesus' notoriety was just cranking up. And we read in the book of Acts it wasn't just him, but other people, like other quote unquote messiahs, were showing up, and of course people would follow behind them because they were expecting this ascension to come. Of course, what made Jesus more popular than the average, Messiah claimer was because he had all these miracles to back him up. And it's interesting that we have this blind beggar story and Jesus performs a miracle here, because when you have a miracle like that happen in front of you, well, of course you're going to think that like, oh, this guy is definitely the Messiah. We're ready to kick some Roman ass. And so that That is no doubt what is happening at the end of this chapter. And that's the mindset people have as Jesus enters Jerusalem. All right, so let's read through chapter 19. Just take a quick water break and play with my cat a little bit here. Because she's a double-minded little thing. Well, on the one hand, like I said at the beginning of the stream, she's like, what the cat wants is like, oh, I want a warm place to sit. Your lap seems like a nice warm place to sit. Okay, in order for this to work, you need to stop moving so I can get comfortable. That includes breathing, petting, scratching, giving me a nice little face scratch or anything like that. No, you can't do any of that because then I won't be able to sleep. And that's my cat's thinking. I mean, it's not just my cat. Every cat does this. They like to. That's just what they like to do. They sit on your lap and they try to take a nap there. And that's their thinking behind it. They're hoping you just be completely still. So now that, because I'm constantly moving, the cat's like fidgety. And so you just pet her enough to make her go away. Yeah, it's reverse psychology. Because when you pet the cat too much, she's like, oh, okay, there's too much touching. And if there's too much touching, it's uncomfortable. So clearly I'm not going to be comfortable here. And so the cat will leave. That's actually how that works. A little bit of knowing how to deal with your cat. You pet them too much and then they'll go away because they realize that they're not comfortable anymore. And then they're like, okay, I'm not going to be comfortable, therefore I can't sleep here. And if I can't sleep here, then I'll go somewhere else. Right, Mishi? See if you can see her. And move the camera down a little bit. See her. Sit up here. Hey, Missy, look at the camera. Hey, come on, look at the camera. Hey. She's like, no. Look at the camera. Come on, look up at the camera. Come on. Look up. Don't stick your butt up at me. She always does. Mean. Cats are mean, you know that, right? People love cats, but they're also... Let's put it this way. People love cats, but cats don't like people. Cats hate people, honestly. I always made this joke about how, like, cats look at humans with disdain. And of course they do, because cat thinks, like, well, this is BS, My ancestors fought fang and claw for millions of years to evolve and claim our place in this world. And then humans show up and get a free ride to the top. In a cat's mind, that's like the ultimate weenie dog, like weenie dog BS. That's why cats hate humans. I swear that's why cats hate humans. They're like, how does a younger, inferior race get to be the ones in charge? I mean, to be fair, that doesn't make sense from an evolutionary stance. The older, stronger race should obviously be the ones in charge, but that's not the case because us humans are at the top of the food chain, and via evolution, humans are a very young race in the grand scheme of things. Yet we are the ones in charge. It's too bad for you, kitty cat. Okay, looks like she's okay with just sitting there for now. So I guess my tactic of petting her till she wanted to leave didn't work. But eventually, we're gonna end the stream in an hour anyway, and she has to move by then. So, because I gotta get up and go to the bathroom at that point. You drink through a whole water during like a stream, and you're like, you want to stay hydrated, but then you also know that later you gotta take a real bad pee. But anyway, it's enough TMI moments with you. Let's read chapter 19. Chapter 19. Now Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name Zacchaeus, He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Hey, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house." So Zacchaeus came down and welcomed him gladly. Now all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is going to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation came to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now while they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. So Jesus said, "A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king, and then return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them, he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. By the way, a mina was like 3 months of wages. That's what my notes here say, so that is a number that may very well vary. "Put this money to work," the master said, "until I come back." But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, "We don't want this man to be our king." Now once this man was made king, he returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money, in order to find out what they had gained with it. Now the first one came and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 10 more." "Well done, my good servant," his master replied. Because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities." The second came and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 5 more." And his master answered, "You take charge of 5 cities." Then another servant came and said, "Sir, here is your mina. I have kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you, because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in, and you reap what you did not sow." Then the master replied, "And I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, didn't you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I didn't put in, and reaping what I didn't sow? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit, so that when I came back I could have collected it with interest?" Then he said to those standing by, "Take this mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10. "Sir, he already has 10, they replied. Then the master said, "I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who do not want me to be king over them, bring them here to me and kill them in front of me." Now after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany, at the hills called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" Now those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they replied, "Well, the Lord needs it." So they brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the roads go down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Now some of the Pharisees in the crowd said, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "And I say to you," Jesus replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If even you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." And when Jesus entered the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. "It is written," he said, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Now every day Jesus was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they couldn't find any way of doing it, because all the people hung onto his words. Okay, so that's chapter 19. Chapter 19 has a lot in it. Could almost be its own stream, but you can just read up many a pastor's sermons about some of these topics. So we're just going to kind of go over them pretty quickly. So first we had this story about this dude named Zacchaeus. And apparently Zacchaeus was a gnome and wasn't very tall. So he had to climb a tree so he could see Jesus as Jesus was walking by. Of course, Jesus ends up picking him of all people to kind of stay at his place. Now here's the funny thing. It's almost like nobody ever pays attention. But I mean, I guess it explains why Jesus had to repeat himself a number of times. Because we just read in chapter 18 about how what does God care about? He doesn't care about the people who think they're good. But God cares about the people who, repent their sins and change their ways and ultimately seek after God as opposed to themselves. That's what God's looking for, and that's what Jesus sees in Zacchaeus. Because Zacchaeus is, at first, he's said to be a pretty bad guy. He's a tax collector who's apparently cheated people to become wealthy. But when he confesses that he's done wrong and wants to do right, Jesus points out that salvation has come. And this is the interesting thing too, because we have to contrast chapter 19 with chapter 18 a little bit, where chapter 18 makes this whole deal about first of all how God judges people, which once again comes to light when we talk about Zacchaeus. And then secondly, secondly, we get in this whole thing about how this ascension, if you will, of the Son of Man, and what is the Messiah really going to do? What is the real purpose of the Messiah? And we kind of see it here in Zacchaeus' story, because it is when Zacchaeus changes his ways of not being a shitty human being, basically. That's when Jesus points out salvation has come. Of course, salvation is one of those words that, because it's been part of Christian lingo for so long, people tend to forget what it actually means. Because, the easy Christianese lingo is that it means like a spiritual spiritual cleaning and spiritual being made right. But what salvation actually means is that people are going to be helped and delivered from their current state of living. So you hear some people, the more educated people, you'll hear them use that language when it comes to like homelessness and the salvation that's needed for the homeless. And you could use the word salvation like that, because of course in that context, salvation means to help homeless people not be homeless. And so the word salvation works in that context because it's delivering people who are homeless out of that preposition. Wow, English out the window there, out of their preposition. And so, in the same way, you gotta wonder what's going on here, because I think one of the things when like a person just reads a story at face value, they tend to think like spiritual. Okay, like he's repented, he is now like a believer, but it's not just that. But of course, the more traditional definition of salvation is that Zacchaeus is being taken out of his previous state of living. Of course, once again, it's the scummy tax collector who cheats his own people. And so that's why people, they look down on him, which is ironic because, Jesus has been teaching over and over about how, you know, don't judge people because you're not that different. We should be good to each other. We should always try and bring out the good in people. Yada, yada, yada. As Jesus has been talking many a times before, and I've expounded on those passages quite a bit already. But it's ironic where the people are like, what? Jesus is hanging out with a tax collector? A dirty sinner like Zacchaeus? But, what was Jesus' purpose? What he was doing was he was bringing Zacchaeus out of, his previous state. And so that's one of the interesting things about this Zacchaeus story is that it kind of sums up a lot of those like chapter 18 points we talked about. It just kind of tells it in like a very quote unquote normal story way, like this happened, that happened, as opposed to all the metaphorical stuff that was going on when Jesus was giving parables and stuff like that. Speaking of parables, though, Jesus jumps right into another one, and this parable here is a very strange one. It's a very weird parable. So first of all, we have this story of this noble who's going to become a king. He's going to be crowned king. I guess you could say he's a prince or whatever. And so, at the get-go, you can already see, this whole ascension thing again. As we covered at the end of chapter 18, this kind of ascension process. And so, Jesus tells this ascension process a very normal, real way. A prince becomes king. It's pretty straightforward. You can't explain ascension easier than that concept. A prince becomes king. So the prince becomes king, but while he's going to go and get himself crowned, he delegates people to do work with some money because I guess he's a businessman too. I mean, to be fair, any kingdom is a business, and you got to keep it going, otherwise your kingdom will fall to ruin. And by that definition, every business is a kingdom. So yes, we have kingdoms in the modern age, if you think about it like that. But anyway, so this master goes off and he gets himself crowned. Now, what's interesting in this story is that there's this funny part where I remember I was having this discussion with like a old friend of mine, and we were talking about this passage. And it's interesting where we were talking about how Jesus was obviously relating the story to himself in like it's kind of ironic. It's another one of those ironic moments, and I've pointed out that the Bible has a lot of these kind of like the Bible likes to play on irony. One, the writers are shown to be more realistic people because the writers, I guess, have a sense of humor and like to write in irony very often. And so the irony here is that like, okay, so we're talking about an ascension. A prince becomes king. At the same time, we've been talking about like how Jesus is going through this ascension process, if you will. But in reality, what's happening is that people are excited. They're expecting the Messiah, to do his whole Roman, kicking Roman ass thing. and reestablishing the throne of David. That's what people are expecting. But in this parable, Jesus talks about how that is like, people don't want that. They want to maintain with the status quo. Now, this is kind of a hot take, but, and to be fair, because we've seen the pendulum swing both ways, there's a reason why status quos exist. And it's kind of ironic where people talk about, oh, we got to break the status quo because it holds us back as a society. But at the same time, people are holding on to a status quo of, the status quo of, say, like socialism, which is a status quo, by the way. Because, to be fair, socialism is older than capitalism. That's a good example of this. But, people want to maintain the status quo because, understandably, since the status quo has been around for as long as it has, then people know that it's there and it works well enough. So we get to this parable, and there's this whole like irony between like people want Jesus to change things. At the same time, Jesus points out in the parable that people really don't want Jesus to change things, because of course Jesus is relating the prince in the story to himself, and the parallel of the prince to king ascension and Jesus' ascension as the Son of Man. But anyway, it's interesting that Jesus points out in the parable that, oh, but the people did not want him to be king. Because of course, with that said, what the implication is that when bringing it back to Jesus, when he becomes king, then things will change around here. That's just how it is. And you read through the book of Revelation, that's clearly what the Revelation is all about. It's about when Jesus returns, there's going to be a lot of changes, lots of them. And at first, the world ain't going to like it because it's too spiritual and too Christian or whatever. And understandable that people may have that objection. But at the same time, if Jesus becomes king, that's how it's going to go down. I don't think you get much say in it at that point. Once he becomes king and starts laying down the new rules, that's just how it's going to be. So there's an interesting bit of irony, and I remember talking about this part of the story, where it's like, oh, the people did not want the king to, or the prince to become king, because I think it has a lot to do with like maintaining the status quo. Because as sucky as it was to live under the Romans, I mean, to be fair, this sounds terrible when you say it out loud, but like at this point in time, the Israelites were used to being subjugated. Whether it was through Egypt thousands of years earlier, whether it was through like the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. At this point, the Israelites were pretty well accustomed to being subjugated to these Gentile societies. And so, on the one hand, it's like, oh, we kind of don't like these Gentiles, but at the same time, we kind of don't want to change the status quo. Which is kind of how things are, in like North American society. We talk about how like, oh man, democracy sucks ass. At the same time, we kind of don't want to change democracy because, well, one, other systems are worse. And two, we've just been doing it for so long. So nothing ever changes. Like, you think of like the last few like American presidential terms. Everybody talks about big change, but yet nothing really happened because the people are like, we don't want things to change. We're too used to it. And in the same way, that's kind of what happens here in this parable that Jesus is talking about. People don't want real change because, well, it is a tall order for starters. And two, the status quo is just so comfortable. It's like that old meme where there's this guy and he's standing in like among a crowd of people and he says, "Who wants change?" And everyone raises their hands. And then the guy then says, "Who wants to change?" And then everyone puts their hands down. It's that meme basically, or that old comic. And it's so telling. And Jesus kind of pokes at that here. And the writers and Luke or the writers, they clearly knew this. They were clearly having fun with that notion, and I'm sure that meme existed back then too, because I mean that's a a problem of the human condition in general, is that people want change to happen, but people don't want change to happen. You can think of like, remember that whole thing with like what's her face, that uh, Greta Grunberg or whatever, that whole like that kid who stood in the UN and talked about climate change and all that. But then like people talk about climate change all the time and how to save the environment. But then if you were honest with yourself and really looked at it properly, like how to fight climate change, in order to bring actual to fix the climate, you would actually require a lot of people to give up a lot of things that they have today. But let's be real, nobody's gonna do that. You think I'm gonna give up having a nice ass house with insulation like this? You think I'm gonna, well, this shack with decent insulation, but hey, it's better than nothing. It's better than a lot of things. Hey, you think I want to give up having like the world at my palm with my smartphone? You think I want to give up having a sick ass, $2,000 computer, but it has to suck a lot of electricity? You think I'm gonna give that up? Hell no. And if you ask anyone else that kind of question, no one would give that up willingly. And why would anyone want to? And so in the same way, that's kind of the irony, and that's part of the human condition too, is that like, well, people aren't going to give up things that have made life comfortable for real change, quote unquote. And it's why, if you look at from a political standpoint, why real change doesn't happen. Everybody talks about there's got to be real change in our society, but no one will actually do it because it requires everyone to change, and I don't think people are going to make that. People are going to make that plunge. Well, to be fair, it is scary, but it's, you could bring the whole battling your inner demons parallel to it, and it makes the same amount of sense. It's a scary thing, and I don't think people are willing to do it. But anyway, going back to Jesus talking about this prince becoming a king, even though the normal people are are comfortable with the status quo, the king still plans ahead, and he thinks about what will happen when he becomes king. So he puts his little test to his servants. We got 10 of them, but we only hear about like 3 of them. We got 10 of them, and he gives them basically a huge sum of money. Now the Bible calls it a mina, and my Bible notes says that a mina is roughly 3 months of wages. So let's say, we'll use myself as the example. I get paid, how much do I get paid a month? I get paid roughly, I get paid about like just over $2,000 a month, just over that. I make about you guys think I'm rich or something, but it's really not that much. It's like not that much more than minimum wage. I get paid like just over $1,000 every 2 weeks. That's how much I get paid. So about 2,000 a month. So with that said, this is before taxes, obviously, because I mean, damn greedy ass government shoving your hands in people's pockets. That's why nobody has money, by the way. It's the real reason why nobody has money. It's because people, the government's constantly shoving their hands in your pocket. It's annoying. But anyway, I get paid roughly 2,000 a month. So 3 months would be 6 grand. Let's say 6 grand. So basically, the master entrusts each of these guys 6 grand Canadian. I guess we're gonna bump that down to American money, so you Americans can feel like, oh yeah, that makes more sense. Let's say 4,500 US. So basically, 4,500 US is how much I make in 3 months. And so that's how much this master is delegating to each of these guys here, 4,500 US, and says, here, make profit from it. Try to make me some monies while I go get crowned. And so we get the report of 2 of these servants, and one guy, he makes like a whopping, like, what is it, 45 grand? Yeah, he makes a, he multiplies it by 10, so you go from 4,500 to 45 grand. Yeah, so he goes for 45 grand, which is pretty sweet. I mean, that's basically how much. That's more than how much you get paid in a year. So, uh, yeah, so that's how much the first guy makes. The second guy makes half of that because he only gets 5 times as much. And the master's pretty happy about this. The 45 grand and the 22 grand, 22,500. And so the master's pretty happy about this and says, "All right, I'm going to make you guys in charge of cities." Of course, I mean, yeah, I can't really make a modern comparison with that because cities back in the ancient world and cities today are two very different things. It's easy to do currency conversions. It is not easy to do how you uh, a landscape scaling conversion. But basically, he's giving them charge of pretty large territories for 10 cities and 5 cities to each of these guys. I mean, to be fair, that's way more than what 45 grand and 22 grand and $500, respectively. So, I mean, this master's entrusting a lot to these guys. But then we get to the third servant who does nothing. He hides it away. And then the servant criticizes the master. And so he criticizes the master by saying, "Well, I know you're a harsh man, even though you don't do anything." Is basically what he's telling him. You reap what you don't sow. You don't put in. You take out what you don't put in. You reap what you don't sow. And so the servant is being really critical of his master, which is generally something you don't do. And so the master judges him this way and says, "Well, if that's how you judge people, then I will judge you accordingly." And so we're back to that whole judging theme. And, this is consistent with stuff Jesus has said in the past. So, do not judge lest you be judged. Well, that's exactly what's happening with this servant now. He was critical of his master. So the master becomes really critical with him and says, "Okay, well, yeah, you judged me for, being kind of lazy, but look who's talking." And it's kind of, like, here's a little coy poke, but that's also one of the big problems of people who talk about like revolutionary change in the world today, is like they criticize people. They criticize, like, for example, oh man, we gotta do this hot take again. I mean, to be fair, I haven't done one of these in a while, but hey, this is streaming Parson stream, so what did you expect? But it's the same thing where like people complain about sexism in the higher ups. You think of like the entertainment industry and the amount of abuse that women go through there. Oh god, it sounds terrible that I have to mention this, and it sounds even worse the fact that I even know about this. But let's be real. Anyone who, unless you keep your head in the sand, everyone knows this happens. We call it the couch interview. If you don't know what that is, do not look it up. The couch interview. So that's how it is in Hollywood, and of course, people come out years later and say, "Oh, sexual misconduct." And it's so easy to judge the guys on the higher up, these CEOs of entertainment businesses and whatnot. But of course, no change really happens. You have the Me Too movement and all that. I know it's an old ass movement, but work with me here. And it works for my illustration. But the reason why no real change happens is because, well, you think about on the ground level, well, people do that kind of crap all the time. And sexual misconduct. The male feminist is a prime example. So why do women continue to face so much injustice? Is because, yeah, we can be critical about the higher ups, like in the entertainment business, for instance, and the couch interviews. We can be super critical of that, as well as you should be. But at the same time, there's too many people in the among us common folk where, well, they're not better. They're just as bad, if not worse. And you get your male feminists who are sexual predators, that kind of thing. And so, going back to this parable of the servants and the minas, it's kind of this kind of ironic twist where the servant judges the master for something he himself is lazy and ungrateful. And so the master says, well, if you're, look who's talking, and if you're going to judge me that way, I will judge you accordingly. And thus has the guy punished, and his thing is taken away from him, his mina, and then given to the guy who is responsible, the guy who doesn't act like a little bitch. And so it's just kind of funny that I think the story plays out that way. And what Jesus is kind of talking about here is also really important for us as well, where once again the dangers of that complacency. And I know many Christians will immediately talk about the complacency in our spiritual lives, which is often how this passage is preached on. So the TLDR of it is that, well, God gives us all talents and abilities and opportunities to do ministry, and we should never squander that. Hence why the streaming Parson exists. But anyway, basically many pastors talk about this passage and talk about how like we shouldn't squander the gifts God has given us. And so if we do squander them, like the Christian who does nothing, then they get judged pretty harshly, because you have the good news of the gospel. Why are you not sharing it with people, etc.? And so that's the easy Christian application. But even in a general sense, this is very true as well, where in life you have responsibilities, you have duties, you have obligations, and you have to live up to them. And you can't go around being lazy, even though it's so easy to judge those who appear lazy. You think of like those old political cartoons where you have like the fat capitalist, and he just kind of lazes around. He's fat because he lazes around and just eats all day. And it's so easy to judge them. But at the same time, the common, us as people normally, like, think about how you live your life. And are you and I've talked about this in great detail when, at the end of 2021, when I was about, be the blessing you want to be. Or sorry, be the blessing you want to see. Sorry, misquoting myself. Be the blessing you want to see in 2022 was kind of how I ended 2021. And the TLDR of that was basically, if you want to see people's lives improve, well, you have to be a person who does it. You have to make people's lives better if you want to see things improve. If you want your life to be better, you have to be the one who makes it better. And it starts with you. You start with making yourself better, and then as you make yourself better, that makes you able to make other people's lives better, because then you can be more generous, you can be more loving, you can be kinder, all those things. But you have to do that for yourself. I know that's something that people parrot all the time, but then you run into the problem of who actually does that. And there's a whole we just know, we're going back with New Year's resolutions as an example. People make New Year's resolutions, and then statistics say that by the first month, over 80% have dropped off from their New Year's resolutions by the end of January. And it's because people claim about wanting change, but they don't change. Because change is not an external force. It is something that you must do within yourself first, and then the other stuff happens. So, you can bring this all back to the other stuff we've talked about with this stream. Repentance, forgiveness from God, all those things, well, they come from you wanting to change and you proactively desiring that change. And it's one of those things that to put it in Christianese, they talk about how okay, well, sure, God can forgive you of your sins, but does it matter if you're not going to live as if you're forgiven? Does it even matter? Are you a convincing enough Christian to other people if you live your life as a shitty human being and not a better person? Will people be convinced? Well, obviously not. But that change has to start with you. God doesn't just magically make things happen. You can't just say, okay, I want to be different tomorrow. Boom, God's going to do it like a genie and the three wishes. It doesn't happen like that. You have to be proactive in how in the change you want to see. And so my extension of that is, if you want people to have better lives and be the blessing you want to see, you can't rely on like, well, God will just bring miracles into my life. It doesn't happen like that. Sometimes you are the means of a miracle happening in not just your own life, but in other people's lives. And when people talk about like guardian angels and stuff like that, well, in a way, we are meant to be each other's guardian angels. We are meant to. That's part of loving your neighbor. That's part of God's command and mandate for us to love our neighbors. Is that we care for each other, and we can appear like guardian angels to other people when we are that blessing that we want to see, and be a blessing in someone else's life. That kind of thing. And so that is that was the inverse of what I was talking about. The whole, if you want goodness, you have to be that goodness. You have to display, and this is where, once again, the Christianese way of putting it is, if you want to show you have to you can't just say you love God, you have to show that you love God. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by loving your neighbor. And that's why those two commandments are so close together, love God and love your neighbor, is because, yeah, you can say you love God, but you kind of have to prove it. And how do you prove it? By loving your neighbor. And so that goes back to what I was originally talking about with this spiritual elements that pastors tend to talk about with the Mina story, and talk about how, like, well, we all have opportunities to be blessing in other people's lives, so don't squander it. And so, I mean, that's why the streaming Parson exists, is to not squander it. And so, if this word reaches, changes somebody's life, it would all be worth it. But that's the point of this, is that, with what little we have, what little God has given us, you must use it to, in the Christianese sense, to further the kingdom. But you have responsibilities in your life to make your life and other people's lives better. And so that is what I wish to do. And that's what I think I'm doing anyway with this channel. And, it's not just through like this, but obviously, there are many ways and many opportunities and for us to, enrich other people's lives, which is what God commands us to do. All right, we got to speed up here. We're going to finish this. So we have two little short stories. Well, it's really one story. And so basically we have this Jesus enters Jerusalem story. And many people refer to this as like the Palm Sunday, which happens like a week before Easter. Speaking of which, I mean, Easter is coming up in like 3 weeks. Less than that, actually. It's actually coming up pretty soon. Oh, crap. Easter's coming up real soon. But anyway, just in time for the reading streams to do the Easter story during Easter. I swear I did not plan that out. That was not intentional. Or was it? But anyway, basically we had this Jesus enters Jerusalem story, typically referred to as Palm Sunday in Christian tradition. And basically Jesus enters Jerusalem, and it basically is where he spends the last of his time until his death anyway. So we have some, well, we ended with him entering Jerusalem, but then of course chapters 20 and 21 have some teachings there. And he teaches even up to the end, basically, because Jesus has a job to do. So anyway, this story of Jesus entering Jerusalem is a very interesting story because, we had this whole talk of chapter 18 and 19 about this ascension. And, the ascension of, well, the Son of Man being the Messiah. And then Jesus used the parable later on in chapter 19 with this whole, like, prince becomes a king. And then now we have more of this ascension kind of theme where Jesus enters Jerusalem, once again going back to the whole Son of Man and the Messiah thing. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that the way Jesus does it is very strange. Now, of course, if you know in Christian lingo and if you've been going to church for a long time, some people get desensitized to this and treat it like it's kind of normal. Well, it's really not at all. So how does Jesus enter Jerusalem? Well, he rides a colt. If you don't know what that is, you might have to go back to grade school. A colt is basically a young donkey. And so, like, first of all, you don't think donkeys would make the greatest amount. I mean, I guess donkeys can run pretty fast, but they're not like, you know, a donkey. You don't think of a donkey as being like a cool ass animal you wanna, you want as a mount. You know, you think of like any fantasy video game. You never see a donkey as being a mount. It's either like, obviously your typical horse, maybe like an elephant. An elephant would be a pretty sick mount. I mean, to be fair, that's also a real thing in India. You think of like in video games, they love having tigers as mounts. I mean, to be fair, a tiger mount would be pretty sick. But you don't think like a donkey would make a sick mount. You don't think that, right? You don't think that a donkey would make a sick mount. But that's the one Jesus picks. And not even like a full grown donkey. It's like a teenage donkey. And so there's something important about this, which we'll bring up later. So Jesus, first of all, he picks a donkey of all things. Once again, not the coolest mount you could show up on. And you think of, going back with my fantasy video game illustration and fantasy stories, you think of like movies like Lord of the Rings or whatever. I mean, Lord of the Rings does it so well. I mean, the significance of riding into a town. And of course, there's a symbolism too that's often used the symbolism exists because of how society did things in, them olden days. But basically, when you rode into town on a horse, it was like it's like showing status and power. So you think of like status and power. Well, you either think a nobleman would ride a horse, or you think a knight. That's a good example. A knight, like in Lord of the Rings. We use Lord of the Rings as our reference. The knights come into the palace or the castle gates. And the knights look so majestic as they're riding their horses and their sick ass battle armor and everything. And the knights they've ridden in and there's this military connotation. And of course, the people expect the news of either there's victory, and usually when the knights ride in all proud, there's victory. Of when the knights ride in with like one knight rides in alone, it's a sign of defeat kind of thing. That kind of thing. It's typical in those fantasy movies and medieval style movies. And that's kind of realistic too. That's how it would play out. And so, you think of riding into a town if Jesus is trying to make a statement of like, the Messiah is coming and the ascension process is underway. You think, okay, on a horse, being awesome. That's what you think, but that's not what Jesus does. Instead, he picks a colt, a very unassuming animal. So you don't think like a donkey, a guy riding on a donkey in a town, like this guy's gonna be awesome. You don't think that, but that's what Jesus does. Now the interesting thing about the colt that is not flat out said in the Bible, but many of Bible scholars all agree on this. I have no reason to disagree. But basically, when you have a colt, when a donkey is referred to this way, it means that think of it as like, well, think of like a minor that still lives with the parents and are under their guardianship. You're not of age, if you will. You're not legally 18 for your American illustration. So a colt refers to like a teenager that still is under like the full guardianship of the family, with exceptions, of course. But in the same way, people treated animals somewhat this way. Some animals are not fully separate from their parents until they become of a certain age. And then the animal is then treated like its own, animal. So when you talk about like a colt, you're talking about that like a donkey under that kind of circumstance, as opposed to like, if I just said a donkey, you could assume anything. And usually you could assume an adult donkey. If I was going to say like I rode a donkey, you assume like I have a donkey and it's an adult donkey. I don't know why I'm talking about riding donkeys. But anyway, I mean, I don't think that'd be that great of an experience. I've ridden a horse once in my life, and it was not as hype as I thought it'd be. Because, once again, I'm a huge like medieval studies buff, and I thought like, dude, riding a horse would be the sickest thing, but it wasn't. My expectations were a bit too high, I guess. I mean, not that it was a bad experience, but it's not like the most amazing thing ever. But anyway, sidetrack over. The colt, when you refer to the donkey as a colt, actually, young horses could also be referred to as colts as well. It's that they're still with their parent, usually a mother donkey or horse or whatever. So that's interesting that this colt is selected. And with that said, the formality of it, as Bible scholars like N.T. Wright would talk about, is that the mother would actually still be present. The mother donkey would be present and would ride along with the colt. Now this is very interesting once you point that out, and why the Bible uses the word colt as opposed to just saying like Jesus rode a donkey into town, is that there are two donkeys, and you think there's only one rider, but there's a spiritual significance of this, and it's kind of the whole missive of Jesus, if you will, is that there's a symbolism of the Father also being present. And this is something that, like, you know, you read through the Bible and you may forget that this happens, that like when Jesus is doing stuff, technically the Father and the Spirit are present and the Trinity is at work. But, you know, it's so easy to forget about that at times, and understandable why you would forget that would happen at times, because it's not like Jesus makes a big scene of like, everywhere I go, the Father and the Spirit are here. Like, he doesn't do that. It's kind of just implied. And so it's easy to forget about it sometimes. But when we have this riding the colt scene, we have the parent donkey as well. And so there's this kind of interesting imagery that's playing out here of the Father is also present, invisibly, magically, using the mother colt, or the mother donkey, sorry, it wouldn't be a colt. You can't have a mother colt. I mean, I guess children can have children. Spay or neuter your child today. But anyway, so you have this mother colt. Anyway, technically, children can have children. So there's that. Spay or neuter your child today. Okay, so where that comes from, I might as well explain this joke, but because it really doesn't work without context. So I remember when I was raising, you know, this old cat right here, still sitting on my lap. I took her to a vet once, and there was this poster, and it was the funniest shit I ever seen. It was a picture of this like kitten, and it was like zoomed in really close on him, so like the poster's just like his face, this kitten's face. And then the words on it says, "Kittens can have kittens. Spay or neuter your cat today." And so I made this crude joke about like, children can have children. Spay or neuter your child today. And so, I mean, it's not untrue that children, you know, children can have children. Teen pregnancy is a real thing. So, that went dark and morbid, but hey, this is streaming Parson channel. You knew what you signed up for. But anyway, back to the donkeys, I guess you should say, because yeah, with Jesus riding a colt, it's implied that there are two donkeys, just as there are two riders. And so, the other thing too that many Bible scholars point out is that, of course, the colt would be pulled along by its mother. In the same way, and I think the spiritual kind of implication here is how Jesus acts in the will of the Father. And he is constantly acting in the will of the Father. Just like with this interesting two donkeys thing, where the mother, the colt is led by its mother, Jesus is led by the Father. And so it's kind of interesting that like this scene, there's a lot more to it than what is simply said, because of course a lot of it is implied, and secondly, it's all language things too. And I think the English translator caught this pretty well by keeping the donkey referred to as a colt and doesn't just say donkey. And of course, there's the other kind of interesting thing about the humility of Jesus, that one, he's led by the Father's will. So even though Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man and all the implication with that, you know, being the awesome guy that God calls God, so there's that. You know, Jesus obviously puts that title upon himself, so you think that he would be at the top, because that's what the book of Daniel kind of implies. And once again, the excitement of the Magi in Matthew is that the Son of Man is implied to be greater than the Ancient of Days. It's implied that in the book of Daniel. But when we read here with Jesus and the way he still acts being led by the Father. Whereas, once again, the Son of Man title would suggest the inverse, that the Son of Man is the greater one. But the way Jesus acts here, and once again, this is why the donkey thing works so well, because Jesus keeps the humble attitude that he serves the Father and that he obeys the Father's will. And this, of course, plays a huge significance as we talk later on, as we move toward the Passion, and which we'll obviously talk about if we get closer to Easter and all that. But the humility of the donkey is very interesting, because we read that the donkey doesn't have a saddle. Doesn't have a saddle. Because, of course, little bit of trivia, saddles are custom made for horses. You can't just put a saddle on a random horse and expect it to, one, fit, two, have your ass fit on it, and three, means that the horse can be ridden. It doesn't work like that. The saddles are custom made that way. That's why, like, if you actually look at like online of like a cost of a horse saddle, those things are expensive. Because remember, the saddle makers have to make them from scratch, custom made. They check the horse of which it's gonna go on, because it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Because of course like horses and saddles, it's like a coming of age thing as well for a lot of horses. That's how we tend to treat it anyway. And so like the horse is like a real mount, if you will. And so in the story we have the donkey that doesn't have a saddle. And so what do the disciples do? They just put their cloaks over the donkey, which also has its own significant meaning, which is interesting as well. And it's also ironic that they put their cloaks over the donkey. But basically there's this humble approach of the ascension process has not yet happened. But of course, you know, from the reader's perspective, you're supposed to wonder, but at the same time, the reader doesn't wonder, because once again, this is after Luke wrote this after the book of Acts occurred. Therefore, people knew exactly what was happening. But if you were reading the Bible for the first time, you might not catch it right away. Which is why I'm talking about it. But basically, the ascension process hasn't happened, if you will, at this point in time for Jesus. And so the donkey is treated in the same way. The colt is not given a proper saddle because it's not of age. And is not, the donkey hasn't had its own quote unquote ascension. So yeah, even donkeys get ascensions, I guess, at this point. I guess anything is fair game. If a donkey can have an ascension ritual, anything's fair game. But basically, there's that process of ascension, and that it hasn't happened yet, which is another interesting thing of why the donkey has no saddle. And so the disciples put their cloak on it, which is actually ironic, because, it's one of those funny things where, once again, Christians have been doing this out of tradition for so long. I think a lot of people forget the significance of when, on Palm Sunday, the disciples removed their cloak and they put it in the way of the rider. Now we're going to do a little bit of a word lesson here. I know we're already like a bit over time, but we're going to finish with this. And then maybe we'll start the next chapter. We'll start next stream with a little bit of talking about the temple bit, because it will become relevant again in chapter 20 anyway. So we'll kind of just finish talking about the donkey thing, and then we'll end the stream. But anyway, when people removed their cloaks as a rider came in, it was expectant of military prowess and military news. Little word lesson. This is actually where the word gospel comes from. Now, it's one of those funny things where, like, once again, the word gospel is a word that's been used by Christian tradition for so long that everyone associates the Christian meaning behind it, but the word itself actually has a very different meaning, just like the word salvation. Now, the word gospel actually means like a news report related to military matters. So technically, as morbid as this sounds, talk like news about, as they bring up updates of, say, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how the war is going, that technically counts as gospel in a very wooden sense of the word, of what the word gospel means. Of course, once again, if, as we're talking about it here, when I say the gospel, I obviously refer to, like, Christianity. But the word itself, gospel, means like a war report. And so you think of, well, there's obviously the contrast of the Romans and why the word gospel would be used in regards to the writings about Jesus, because it's meant to also contrast emperor cult religions in Rome and stuff like that. And of course, the Jews really identifying themselves as being faithful to, like, the King Jesus, and there's all that too, which we'll talk about way more in depth when we get to the Book of Acts, because that is a whole can of worms I am not opening right now. So anyway, the word gospel means a war report. It's commonly understood as, like, you think of, like, once again, you have to use like fantasy movies and medieval kind of movies as your reference here. But when a knight enters a town, there's like that guy, they call him the herald, and the herald talks about, like, this is Sir, Ulrich von Liechtenstein has entered, right? And so that's kind of what a gospel is when the herald or the cantor is talking about the person that they're representing. And so that's kind of what's so with that said, I want you to keep that image in your mind. Think of the knight entering, and there's the herald yelling, here's Ulrich von Liechtenstein. Hit a like if you know that reference. Ulrich von Liechtenstein has entered. That is technically gospel. And so with that said, you have to looking back at the end of chapter 19 here, that's kind of what's happening. And in a sense, you're having a gospel moment where Jesus rides into town. But of course, the scenery is kind of like jarring, because it's a carpenter on a teenage donkey, and yet there's heralding and people doing gospel noises talking about, here comes, Jesus, the son of David. And, this duality of, is Jesus ascended into the Messiah role or has he not? And there's that weird ambiguity in that. Of course, to the audience, the churches after the Book of Acts would have known exactly what was going down. Once again, I'm kind of trying to spell this out for a first-time reader, but the people are expecting things, but at the same time, is it fulfilled or is it not? What is going to happen? What will Jesus do? And at the same time, this is a big deal, because, with that question, what will Jesus do? Will it change things? Will change happen? Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, which you'll have to wait for next stream, because, well, obviously we're going to stream pretty soon. But just to finish off the rest of this little talk here about the riding the colt story, as these guys are having their, the people are praising, shouts, Hosanna, God in the highest, and all that, and having this gospel moment, the taking off of their cloak is also a warrior's tribute. So it's interesting. There's this, Jesus enters humbly as a carpenter, But yet there's a warrior's tribute given to him with the praising as Jesus enters and the laying down of their cloaks, which is a warrior's tribute. And more often that once again there's that older Jewish thinking of the Messiah coming in to kick some Roman ass. And so the laying of their cloaks is a warrior's tribute that they're giving to Jesus, which is interesting. And so once again, that the expectations are really high because they're once again for hundreds of years now, the Jewish people are expecting this military leader because that was a thing. And that is one of the main expectations of the Messiah, is that he would be this great military leader. And so even though Jesus rides in humbly, following the will of the Father, invisibly riding the mother donkey, the people still give Jesus the warrior's tribute. And it's a really interesting contrast that you see here. It's really jarring. It's a very strange scene, even though, like, you know, you go to a church on Palm Sunday and they treat it like it's so casual. But if you want to, you know, be the smart guy in the room, you can always talk about, like, yeah, we're giving warrior tribute. Palm Sunday is a warrior tribute. Any self-respecting Christian will be like, yeah, we sure are, because, you know, we got to fight the forces of darkness in this world. And hence why, you know, when Jesus enters the town, we give him a warrior's tribute. And so Easter, as Easter approaches, you know, and we expect God to do great things, and not just our own lives, but in the lives of those around us, we give Jesus the warrior tribute. And it's interesting because it brings back, you know, that is who Jesus is as well, that he is a warrior. Which I know many people tend to forget because, you know, you read through a lot of the Gospels, and once again, it's like the ultimate irony. It's called the Gospels, and yet people think Jesus is a pacifist, which makes no sense because he certainly wasn't. And, you know, here we read as Jesus enters Jerusalem, he is given a warrior's tribute. Anyway, I've gone way over time. Well, technically I started 5 minutes late, but I went like 15 minutes over. Well, 10 minutes over, technically, if you think about it. But anyway, I think it's a good place to stop. There's a lot more content to cover. We'll cover the temple part at the end of chapter 19 next week. Because, of course, it bleeds into chapter 20. Because chapter 20, Jesus teaches at the temple a whole bunch. So there's that. So we can talk more about Jesus at the temple next week. So that's going to be next Friday at 3 o'clock. However, with that said, we're just going to do some short announcements. We have at least 2. I'm going to try and fit in a third Triangle Strategy Let's stream this next week. Because 1, I'm just loving that game. So I want to play through it. I want to get through the game because I'm having so much fun. And 2, you know, once again, as people are beating the game now, like multiple beat throughs, like, oh my god, I can't believe that people have so many, like, quote unquote final battles already on YouTube. I have to avoid all of them. Like, why? Don't spoil me. But, you know, I want to get through the game. Not that it's a chore. I'm enjoying Triangle Strategy, but also I want to play it. I want to play it more. But I also don't want to rob you guys of my first impressions of the game by playing through it, like, off stream. But you can be sure that I will play the game again and make a whole bunch of different choices. In my next playthrough. Hashtag Huette best girl. Hashtag Huette route. That's what I'm playing now. Although I technically cheated at the beginning because I didn't pick the Huette route in the very first choice. But anyway, that's a major sidetrack. The point is, we have Triangle Strategies at least twice next week. The first one will be on Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. The second one will be on Wednesday. I'm going to try and squeeze in a third one because I want to keep playing that game. It's been great. But we'll see. No promises on a third Triangle Strategy stream. So next week's schedule basically looks like Monday and Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time, Triangle Strategy. Next Friday at 3 o'clock, we will continue our Bible read starting in Luke 20. With that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Luke with me. Hope you guys learned something today. And if you have questions, you can PM, you can DM me on Discord. The link is in the description. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys on Monday for more triangle strategy. With that said, take care of yourself and God bless you.